The Bren Gun had been Murphy's unwelcome companion for 3 hours now, its unfamiliar weight shifting against his shoulder as he crouched behind the M36 tank destroyer in the pre-dawn darkness of the Vosges Mountains. The British weapon felt wrong in his hands, too heavy, too deliberate, nothing like the swift violence of his usual bar. Around him, the skeletal remains of Company B were settling into positions that everyone knew wouldn't hold once the Germans decided to push through the frozen crossroads south of Holtzwihr. Private First Class Latty Tipton slid into the shallow foxhole beside the tank destroyer, his breath forming white clouds in the January air. The kid's face still carried the soft roundness of farm country, though weeks of grinding combat through these snow-choked forests had carved new lines around his eyes. "Murph, you really think that old British piece is gonna do us any good when they come?" Murphy worked the Bren Gun's bolt mechanism, still learning its rhythm. The weapon had been discovered in an abandoned Allied supply cache, dismissed by their lieutenant as obsolete junk until their own machine gunner took shrapnel during the morning's artillery barrage. Now, with grey, uniformed figures moving through the tree line 600 yards away, obsolete junk was all that stood between 18 American soldiers and a German company advance. "Better than harsh language," Murphy replied, though his eyes never left the approaching enemy. He counted their numbers through the morning mist that clung to the muddy fields. 3 squads in the center, flanking elements using the drainage ditch on the left. What looked like a mortar team establishing position behind a burned-out farmhouse. The tactical picture painted itself clearly. If Company B retreated now, the crossroads would fall within minutes, cutting off the entire battalion's supply line deeper in the Vosges Mountains. The sound of boots splashing through half-frozen mud announced movement behind them. Lieutenant Morrison appeared at the tank destroyer's flank, his map case already spattered with the kind of dirt that told its own story about the morning's confused retreat. "Murphy, new orders from battalion. We're falling back to secondary positions. The armor support that was supposed to arrive isn't coming." Tipton started gathering his gear, but Murphy remained motionless, studying the German advance with the patience of a hunter who'd learned his trade in Texas fields long before he'd ever heard of the Vosges Mountains. The enemy was closing methodically, using terrain features with the skill of veterans who'd fought across half of Europe. If they reached the crossroads unopposed, they'd have clear sightlines to rake any American withdrawal with enfilading fire. "Tell the men to start moving back," Murphy said quietly. "I'll cover the withdrawal with this thing." Lieutenant Morrison followed Murphy's gaze toward the approaching Germans, then looked down at the Bren Gun with skepticism that he tried to mask as tactical consideration. The weapon's distinctive profile marked it as a relic from earlier campaigns, when British forces had held different sections of the line before the grinding reorganizations that characterized warfare in these final months of 1945. "That's not a one-man job, Sergeant. We'll establish the secondary line and provide covering fire from there." But Murphy had already positioned the Bren Gun on the tank destroyer's rear deck, using the armor plating as a shield while maintaining clear fields of fire across the approaches to the crossroads. The weapon's bipod legs scraped against the metal as he adjusted his position, and he found himself wondering if the British had designed this gun for a different kind of war, one fought from prepared positions rather than the fluid, desperate encounters that had become routine for American infantry advancing through the Vosges Mountains. "Sir, if they take this position, they'll cut us to pieces during the withdrawal. Somebody has to buy time." The words came out matter-of-factly, without heroic emphasis, as if Murphy was discussing the weather rather than a decision that would likely end with him face down in the January mud. Tipton paused in his retreat preparation, torn between following orders and the uncomfortable knowledge that Murphy's assessment was tactically sound. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The German advance slowed as it approached the 400-yard mark, their lead elements beginning the careful probing that preceded a coordinated assault. Murphy adjusted the Bren Gun's position on the tank destroyer's deck, familiarizing himself with sight picture and trigger pull while the enemy organized their attack. The weapon's mechanism felt solid despite its age, engineered with the kind of robust simplicity that had served British forces through years of varied combat across multiple theatres. Lieutenant Morrison lingered behind the tank destroyer, torn between his orders to establish a secondary defensive line and the tactical reality that Murphy had identified. Through his binoculars, he could see German infantry coordinating with hand signals, their movements suggesting a level of unit cohesion that spoke poorly for Company B's chances of conducting an orderly withdrawal under fire. "The secondary position won't hold either," Morrison admitted quietly. "Too much open ground between here and there. They'll have clear fields of fire for 300 yards. Tipton had finished packing his gear, but remained crouched beside the tank destroyer, his young face reflecting the moral complexity that ground combat imposed on men barely old enough to vote. The Vosges Mountains had taught them all hard lessons about the gap between tactical doctrine and battlefield reality, but this morning's situation pushed beyond mere tactical challenge into the realm of pure impossibility. "How many magazines you got for that thing?" Tipton asked, nodding toward the Bren gun. Murphy performed a quick inventory of the ammunition discovered with the weapon. 8 magazines, each carrying 30 rounds of .303 British ammunition that felt heavier in his hands than the familiar American cartridges he'd grown accustomed to during months of combat through these snow-laden forests. "Enough to make them think twice about crossing that open ground," he replied. The German mortar team had completed their setup behind the burned farmhouse, their weapon trained on the crossroads with mathematical precision. Murphy calculated their range and probable impact area, noting how enemy indirect fire would complicate any American withdrawal while simultaneously providing cover for the advancing infantry. The tactical geometry was elegant in its simplicity. Once the mortars began firing, Company B would be caught between explosive impact and rifle fire, with no adequate cover between their current position and the secondary line. Radio static crackled from Lieutenant Morrison's handset as battalion headquarters requested status updates, with the kind of insistent frequency that indicated higher command's growing anxiety about the morning's deteriorating situation. Morrison keyed the microphone twice, acknowledgement without commitment, the universal military signal for situations too complex for simple radio communication. "Battalion wants to know our timeline for reaching secondary positions," Morrison said. Murphy had opened the Bren gun's bipod legs and was adjusting the weapon's elevation, his movements growing more confident as muscle memory adapted to the British design. The tank destroyer's armor plating would provide protection against rifle fire, but the position offered no escape route once enemy forces closed within grenade range. It was a one-way tactical decision, the kind that military manuals discouraged and battlefield necessity sometimes demanded. "Tell them we're moving now," Murphy said. "Don't mention the covering force." Tipton understood the implication immediately. If Battalion knew that one man was staying behind with obsolete equipment to cover an entire company withdrawal, they'd either order him to retreat immediately or send reinforcements that would only increase the casualty count. Some tactical decisions existed in the grey areas between orders and initiative, where junior leaders made choices that senior commanders preferred not to know about until after-action reports transformed messy reality into clean narrative. The German advance resumed its methodical approach, now close enough that Murphy could distinguish individual faces beneath their helmets. They moved with the confidence of veterans who'd successfully conducted similar operations across multiple fronts, their tactical coordination speaking to months of combat experience in the challenging terrain of the Vosges Mountains. Murphy chambered the first round in the Bren gun and settled into a firing position that felt increasingly natural despite the weapon's foreign origin. The morning mist was beginning to lift, providing clearer sight lines across the approaches to the crossroads, while simultaneously removing the concealment that had protected both forces during their initial deployment. Company B's withdrawal began in stages, with the most seriously wounded evacuated first, while the remaining riflemen established hasty firing positions to cover their movement. Murphy watched through the Bren Gun's sights as his friends disappeared into the tree line, their olive-drab uniforms blending with the winter shadows of the Vosges Mountains, until only their footprints remained visible in the churned mud and snow. The German mortar team fired their first ranging rounds, the shells impacting 50 yards short of the crossroads with the distinctive crump that had become the soundtrack to infantry combat throughout these final months of the war. Murphy adjusted his estimate of their capabilities upward. These weren't green conscripts learning their trade, but experienced soldiers who understood how to use indirect fire to shape the battlefield before launching their assault. Radio chatter from adjacent units painted a grim picture of the morning's broader tactical situation. The German counterattack had materialized across a front, stretching from Holzwehr to the heights overlooking the Ill River Valley, catching American forces in positions that had been designed for static defense rather than the fluid combat now developing. Battalion headquarters was requesting situation reports with increasing urgency, trying to piece together a coherent picture from fragments of information transmitted by units under fire. Lieutenant Morrison made his final check of Murphy's position, his expression carrying the weight of command decisions that would require explanation in subsequent after-action reports. The Bren Gun represented their only heavy automatic weapon capable of delivering sustained fire across the approaches to the crossroads, but the tactical mathematics remained unforgiving. One man against a company-sized force, with ammunition that wouldn't last beyond the first serious engagement. "You don't have to do this, Murph. We can call for artillery support. Try to break up their attack before it develops." Murphy tested the Bren Gun's traverse, tracking potential target areas, while keeping the weapon below the tank destroyer's silhouette to avoid premature detection. Artillery support sounded reassuring in principle, but he'd learned through hard experience in the Vosges Mountains that fire missions took time to coordinate, and time was the one resource Company B couldn't afford to expend. "Artillery won't arrive before they're across that open ground," Murphy replied. "And when it does arrive, it'll be landing on our secondary position." Tipton had volunteered to stay behind as an ammunition bearer, but Murphy had refused the offer with the gentle firmness that characterized his leadership style. The kid had already survived more combat than most men experienced in entire wars, no sense adding his name to casualty lists for a mission that required shooting skills rather than additional personnel. The German advance elements had closed to within 300 yards, close enough that Murphy could hear their voices carrying across the winter air. They spoke in the clipped, professional tones of soldiers coordinating tactical movements, their confidence suggesting they viewed the crossroads as a routine objective rather than a defended position. That confidence might prove tactically useful if Murphy could maintain the illusion that he represented a larger force than one man with a foreign weapon. Second mortars joined the first, their combined fire beginning to bracket the crossroads with increasing accuracy. Murphy counted the rounds, timing their intervals and estimating the enemy's ammunition expenditure rate. Mortar teams typically carried limited loads during assault operations, particularly when advancing through the difficult terrain that characterized combat in the Vosges Mountains. If he could force them to expend ammunition suppressing his position, they'd have less available to support the actual infantry assault. The tank destroyer's engine compartment retained enough warmth to provide minimal comfort against the January cold that numbed Murphy's trigger finger. He flexed his hands inside his gloves, maintaining manual dexterity while calculating windage for the morning breeze that carried the acrid smell of cordite and wet wool across the battlefield. The Bren Gun felt increasingly familiar as he adjusted to its balance and sight alignment, though the weapon's slower rate of fire would require more precise shot placement than he was accustomed to with American automatic weapons. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Murphy opened fire when the German lead squad reached the stone wall lining the country road, his first burst catching them in the open ground between cover positions. The Bren Gun's distinctive sound, slower and more deliberate than American automatic weapons, seemed to confuse the enemy infantry initially, who continued their advance as if uncertain where the firing originated. His second burst, aimed at the mortar team behind the farmhouse, scattered their equipment and forced them to abandon their carefully prepared position. The German company commander's tactical response revealed his experience. Instead of rushing the position with overwhelming force, he deployed his men in a careful flanking maneuver that assumed Murphy represented a prepared defensive position supported by additional infantry. This miscalculation bought precious time for Company B's withdrawal, but it also committed Murphy to a sustained engagement that would test both his ammunition supply and the Bren Gun's mechanical reliability under prolonged firing. Enemy rifle fire began probing the tank destroyer's position, rounds sparking off the armor plating with metallic impacts that rang like a broken bell. Murphy kept the weapon below the vehicle's silhouette, between firing positions, using brief exposure periods to engage targets of opportunity while avoiding the concentrated fire that would inevitably develop once the Germans pinpointed his exact location. The Bren Gun's reliability became apparent as the engagement stretched past its first half hour. Unlike the temperamental automatic weapons Murphy had used throughout the campaign, this older design continued functioning despite the moisture, mud, and sustained firing that would have jammed more sophisticated mechanisms. Each magazine change represented a calculated risk, performed during lulls when enemy rifle fire couldn't draw precise aim on his position. German voices shouted tactical information across the battlefield as their company commander adjusted his approach to account for what appeared to be stubborn resistance from a larger force. Murphy's sustained rate of fire suggested multiple weapons to ears that couldn't distinguish the Bren Gun's specific mechanical signature, and his tactical positioning behind armor plating reinforced the impression of a prepared defensive position, rather than one desperate sergeant with obsolete equipment. The mortar team had relocated twice, each time requiring precious minutes to re-establish their firing position, while Murphy engaged their infantry support with carefully aimed bursts. His ammunition expenditure rate remained sustainable through disciplined fire control, engaging only targets that presented clear opportunities while conserving rounds for the concentrated assault that would inevitably develop once German patience expired. Radio static crackled from the tank destroyer's interior, where Lieutenant Morrison's handset continued receiving urgent queries from battalion headquarters about Company B's withdrawal timeline. The voices emerging from the speaker carried the disconnected quality that characterized rear echelon communication, urgent requests for information about tactical situations that couldn't be adequately explained through radio transmissions. Murphy's world had contracted to the immediate geometry of target acquisition and ammunition conservation. The Bren Gun's sight picture had become as familiar as his own reflection, its mechanical rhythm synchronized with his breathing and heartbeat. The weapon's weight, initially a disadvantage, now provided stability for the long-range shots that kept German infantry pinned behind inadequate cover throughout the approaches to the crossroads. Enemy movement patterns revealed their growing frustration with the unexpected resistance. Squads that had approached the engagement expecting routine occupation of abandoned American positions now found themselves committed to a tactical problem that defied easy solution. The crossroads represented a minor objective in the broader context of their counterattack through the Vosges Mountains, but military pride prevented withdrawal in the face of what appeared to be resistance from a handful of stubborn Americans. The tank destroyer's armor plating showed increasing evidence of concentrated rifle fire, with impact marks clustering around the areas where Murphy had been engaging targets. German marksmanship was improving as their shooters identified his firing positions and calculated range corrections for subsequent volleys. The mathematical inevitability of accurate counterfire meant his position would become untenable within minutes unless the tactical situation changed dramatically. The moment that would later appear in official citations as extraordinary valor in the face of overwhelming enemy forces began when Murphy realized the Bren Gun's barrel was too hot to touch and his ammunition had dwindled to 3 magazines. What the citation wouldn't mention was the terror that gripped him as German infantry finally closed to within grenade range, their voices now audible enough that he could distinguish individual words shouted between the stone walls and drainage ditches. Murphy had never spoken about the 17 seconds when his nerve broke completely. Crouched behind the tank destroyer with enemy soldiers approaching from 3 directions, he experienced the kind of paralyzing fear that training manuals never addressed. The absolute certainty that he was about to die alone in a foreign country, his body destined to freeze in January mud until spring thaw revealed what remained of another American boy who'd gotten in over his head. The Bren Gun lay silent beside him as those 17 seconds stretched into something resembling eternity. His hands shook too violently to chamber another round. His breathing came in shallow gasps that fogged his glasses, and his mind filled with images of home. Texas fields under summer sun, his mother's voice calling him in for supper, the simple comfort of a world where young men didn't die for road junctions in the Vosges Mountains. But 17 seconds ended when he heard Tipton's voice calling his name from the tree line 300 yards behind the tank destroyer. The kid had disobeyed orders to evacuate with the rest of Company B, and was now shouting encouragement across a battlefield where German rifles were already turning toward this new target. Murphy's fear transformed instantly into something harder and more sustainable, the cold anger of a man who refused to let his friend die because of his own moment of weakness. The Bren Gun came alive in his hands with mechanical precision that surprised him. The weapon's familiar weight and balance had become extensions of his own body during the morning's engagement, and muscle memory functioned where conscious thought had failed. His first burst caught a German squad crossing the road junction, sending them diving for cover behind a pile of rubble that offered concealment without protection. What happened next defied the tactical doctrine Murphy had learned during training stateside. Instead of conserving ammunition for defensive fire, he began advancing the Bren Gun's position by stages, using the tank destroyer's bulk as mobile cover while engaging targets that appeared throughout the crossroads area. The psychological effect on German infantry was immediate and devastating. They had expected to overrun a static position, not confront an automatic weapon that moved with aggressive confidence. German radio traffic, intercepted months later by intelligence analysts, revealed the confusion that Murphy's tactical improvisation created among enemy commanders. Reports described coordinated resistance from multiple positions, with automatic weapons fire suggesting a reinforced squad rather than one exhausted sergeant who had been fighting continuously for over 2 hours. The Bren Gun's ammunition ran out during Murphy's third firing position, leaving him with his carbine and 2 grenades against German forces that had finally identified his actual location. What sustained him through those final minutes wasn't heroic determination, but the practical knowledge that Tipton was counting on him to keep German attention focused on the crossroads rather than pursuing retreating American forces through the forest. Murphy never discussed the conversation he had with God during those final minutes on the tank destroyer. Years later, when reporters asked about his thoughts during the action, he would mention tactical considerations and concern for his men. But he never mentioned the desperate bargaining with whatever divine authority might have jurisdiction over frozen battlefields in the Vosges Mountains. That remained between him and whatever force had allowed him to survive when survival seemed mathematically impossible. The reinforcements arrived as German patience finally expired, and enemy infantry prepared for a coordinated rush that would have ended the engagement through simple, overwhelming numbers. Fresh troops found Murphy still manning the tank destroyer, his uniform soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature, his eyes tracking movement across a battlefield littered with evidence of the morning's impossible stand. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison arrived with the relief force, his crisp uniform and clean boots marking him as staff rather than line personnel as he surveyed the crossroads that had consumed an entire morning's combat operations. He approached the tank destroyer, where Murphy sat cleaning the Bren Gun with the mechanical precision of a man whose hands needed purposeful activity to avoid shaking. "Sergeant, I need to understand what happened here. My after-action report needs to explain how one man stopped a company-sized attack for over 3 hours." Murphy continued working the Bren Gun's bolt mechanism, his eyes focused on the weapon rather than meeting the colonel's gaze. The mechanical familiarity that had developed during the morning's engagement remained, but now it felt strange and disconnected, as if he was handling equipment that belonged to someone else's war. "Got lucky, sir. They thought there were more of us than there actually were." The colonel's aide photographed the tank destroyer's position and the surrounding terrain, documenting evidence for the citation that would transform the morning's chaos into clean sentences suitable for official records. Murphy watched this process with detached interest, recognizing the gap between what had actually occurred and what would appear in military histories written by men who understood tactics, but had never spent 3 hours wondering if the next minute would be their last. Tipton emerged from the tree line, carrying his rifle and wearing the expression of someone who had disobeyed direct orders for reasons he couldn't adequately explain to superior officers. His presence during the final phase of the engagement would complicate the official narrative, introducing questions about command and control that staff officers preferred to avoid in heroic citations. "You didn't have to come back," Murphy said quietly. "Couldn't leave you out here by yourself. Wouldn't have been right." The Bren Gun sat between them like a mechanical witness to the morning's events, its barrel still warm despite the January cold. Murphy understood that this weapon would disappear into some quartermaster depot, its role in the day's impossible mathematics forgotten, while his name appeared in headlines that reduced 3 hours of terror and confusion to inspiring stories about American determination. 6 months later, in a hospital bed in San Antonio, Murphy would wake from nightmares about the sound of German voices approaching the tank destroyer. The doctors attributed these episodes to combat fatigue and prescribed rest, but Murphy understood that some experiences carved themselves too deeply into memory to be healed through sleep and medication. The weight of the Bren Gun would remain in his hands decades after the weapon itself had been relegated to military surplus. The colonel completed his interview with professional efficiency, gathering facts that would support a Congressional Medal of Honor recommendation while tactfully avoiding questions about Murphy's emotional state during the action. Some aspects of combat psychology were better left unexplored in official documentation, particularly when the resulting citations would be used to maintain morale among troops still fighting in the Vosges Mountains. Company B regrouped at the secondary position with casualty figures that could have been much worse if Murphy's improvised delaying action hadn't bought time for an orderly withdrawal. The men understood what had happened at the crossroads without requiring detailed explanation. Some tactical situations could only be resolved through the kind of individual courage that military doctrine couldn't teach or predict. Murphy rejoined his unit carrying the invisible weight that would accompany him through remaining combat operations and into the civilian world beyond military service. The citation would mention extraordinary valor and tactical innovation, but it couldn't capture the 17 seconds of paralyzing fear or the conversation with God that sustained him when ammunition ran low and German voices grew closer. 30 years later, visiting a veterans hospital in Texas, Murphy would encounter another former sergeant who asked about the action at the crossroads. What did it feel like being a hero like that? Murphy's answer revealed the gap between public legend and private memory. Felt like being scared and doing what needed doing anyway. The rest is just newspaper talk. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.